She opened the door before I could knock a second time. I had lifted my fist to try again, and then the latch moved, and light spilled out across the snow, and she was standing there with a candle in one hand and a look on her face that was not fear. It was simply appraisal, the way a healer looks at something that has arrived broken and must be assessed before it can be helped. "You're soaked through," she said. Not a question. A fact she was already working with. My voice came out wrong, too thin. The fever had been climbing since midday, and I had been ignoring it the way I ignore most things that inconvenience me, by pretending it was not there. "I need shelter. One night, I can pay." She looked at the coin I had pushed forward in my palm, then she looked at me. Then she set the candle on the windowsill and pulled the door wide. "Put the coin away," she said. "You can barely stand." She was right. I did not put the coin away. I stepped inside, and my legs had a conversation with each other that I was not included in, and I sat down on the bench beside her hearth because there was no dignified way to refuse the invitation my own knees were giving me. "My name is Rain. I am the Alpha King of Caravan, and I had been riding alone through the border territories for 5 days because there was a threat moving along my eastern line that I needed to understand with my own eyes, not with the filtered accounts that arrive on my council table, prettied up and partial. I do not make decisions from other men's summaries. I ride out myself. I look, I come back and act. My council hates this. My pack endures it. I have been doing it since I was 19 and I have not died yet, so the arrangement stands." What I had not planned for was a fever that came on fast and mean somewhere near the Graythorn Ridge, or the snowstorm that sealed the pass behind me before I could turn back toward Caravan Hold, or the cottage at the edge of Graythorn Village, smoke coming from its chimney, its single window lit like something left specifically for the lost. I had not planned to knock on a stranger's door and nearly fall through it. She was not alarmed by me. That was the first thing I noticed, after the fact of the warmth, after the smell of dried herbs hanging from the low ceiling, after the small stove and the 2 chairs, and the ordered shelves of a person who lives neatly because they live alone. She was not alarmed by a large man appearing at her door, in the dark of a snowstorm, with a fever climbing behind his eyes. She simply moved around the small space with the ease of someone who has handled worse, setting a second pot on the stove, pulling a folded blanket from a chest by the window. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "Not since this morning." "Then that's 2 problems," she said. "Fever and an empty stomach. Sit there until I tell you to move." I am not accustomed to being told to sit. I sat. Her name, I learned in those first minutes, was Mira. She told me without being asked, which surprised me. She did not seem the sort to offer information without a reason. She said it the way she said everything in those early hours, plainly, without ceremony, as though words were tools and she only used the ones that served. She did not ask mine. I noticed that she did not ask, and I told myself it was fortunate. My name would mean something, even here. Even in a border village that had never seen its king in person, the name Ran of Caravan carried weight. I was not carrying any identifying pieces. I had dressed to blend, to observe, to move without drawing eyes. Plain wool, worn travel cloak, no ring, no mark of office. My horse was stabled at a waypost 8 miles back. I had come the last stretch on foot when the pass closed and the snow came down hard. She brought me broth first, then bread, dense and dark and better than anything my kitchen had produced in recent memory. She sat across from me while I ate, not watching me exactly, but present, her hands working at something in her lap, sorting seed pods, I realized, small dark shells that she was cracking open and collecting into a clay bowl. "You'll sleep here tonight," she said. "The loft is clean. There's a spare mat. I don't want to put you out." She glanced up. There was something in her expression, not amusement exactly, but a kind of quiet patience, as though she had decided not to explain something obvious to me. "You're too ill to sleep in the cold," she said. "You'd be worse by morning. I'd rather you were better." "Why?" She seemed to consider that as a genuine question, which it was. "Because sick things recover," she said finally. "That's what they're supposed to do." She went back to her seed pods. I watched the fire. The fever broke twice that night and came back both times. I was aware of it distantly, the cold sweat, the weight of the blanket, the pull and release of heat, and each time I surfaced enough to be conscious of my surroundings, I was aware of her. She checked on me twice, Set a cup of water within reach. Added wood to the small stove in the loft corner without waking me, moving quiet as anything had ever moved in the dark near me. I am a light sleeper. I have been a light sleeper since I was a boy, because boys who sleep deeply in uncertain houses learn to pay for it. And yet she moved around that loft in the dead hour of the night and I did not startle. I simply knew she was there, the way you know where the walls of a room are even in pitch darkness, not by sight, but by some interior map that forms without your asking. By morning the fever had thinned enough that I could sit up without the room tilting. She was already downstairs. I could hear her, the sounds of water being poured, something being ground, the occasional murmur that I realized after a moment was not words but simply a sound she made when she was working. Low and even, the kind of sound a person makes when they are alone so often that they have stopped noticing they make it. I came down the loft stairs carefully. She looked up from her work table. "Still standing," she said. "Still standing. Sit down before that changes." I sat. She brought me a cup of something that smelled like pine bark and something I could not name, and I drank it, because she set it in front of me with the certainty of a person who expects to be obeyed about medicine, and I found, to my own surprise, that I had no argument with her. "You're a healer," I said. "I trained as one. 3 years with the settlement healers before they moved on." A brief pause. "I mostly tend the village now. Minor things. Wounds that won't close, fevers, the aches that come with age. You're good at it." She looked at me, not flattered, simply assessing whether I was saying it to be polite or because I meant it. "You slept through the worst of it," she said. "That's the fever working the right direction. You'd have been in trouble another few hours in the snow." "I know. You don't seem like the sort of man who lets himself be in trouble." I turned the cup in my hands. I don't usually have a choice about the weather. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, the shadow of one. She turned back to her work table, and I sat there in the warmth of her small kitchen and listened to the snow come down outside her window and felt, for the first time and longer than I could clearly name, like I had arrived somewhere rather than passing through. The storm held for 3 days. I told her I could travel before that. The truth was that by the second morning I probably could have. The fever was gone. My strength was coming back with the food she fed me. Plain good meals that she produced from what looked like a modest pantry, with a kind of quiet efficiency. I could have dressed and found the pass and been back at Caervan Hold by nightfall of the second day. I did not go. I told myself it was the snow. The pass would be treacherous until it settled. The truth was more honest than that, and I knew it, but I did not press the knowing because it was easier to stay where I was. She let me help. That surprised me too. When I offered to carry water from the well in the yard, she handed me the bucket without hesitation, no fuss about whether I was well enough, no performance of gratitude. When I split the firewood she had stacked outside, more than she needed for the current storm, I suspected she had been behind on it before I arrived. She nodded at the sight of it and said, "The north stack was getting low," and that was all. She was not impressed. She was simply noting that a thing that needed doing had been done. I found I liked that more than I could explain. On the second evening she told me about the settlement. Not much. She was not a person who spoke much, but in the small pieces that came out between tasks and cups of tea, and the soft sounds of the fire, I learned the shape of her life here. The settlement healers who had trained her had been good teachers, she said, and she had been glad of the work, but they moved through on regular circuit and she had stayed when they went because the village needed someone, and no one else was offering. "Your family?" I asked. "Gone. No grief in it, not the absent grief of someone who has set it aside, but the settled fact of someone who has made their terms with what is. Some years ago now. I'm used to it. And you don't mind living alone?" She considered this with the same seriousness she gave everything. "I mind certain things," she said. "The silence when there's been too much of it. The way snow sounds different when there's no one to tell about it." She looked at the window, the white dark beyond the glass. "But the work is real. That matters to me more than the quiet." I did not answer for a moment. "What do you do?" she asked then, not challenging, simply returning the balance of the conversation, offering me the same question she had answered. "I manage holdings," I said. It was not a lie. It was not the whole truth. In the north. A steward? Something like that. She accepted this without pressing it. She was not incurious. I could see her thinking, could see her note, that the answer was careful in the way careful answers are. But she did not pursue it, and in the silence I felt the strange weight of being unknown. No one looks at me simply. Every face I encounter knows who I am before they see me as a man, and they arrange themselves around that knowing before a word is spoken. She looked at me as she looked at everything, plainly, as what it was, the cup that needed washing and the fire that needed banking, and the man sitting at her table who had arrived sick and was getting better. It was the most restful thing I had experienced in years. On the third morning, she was checking the dressing on a small cut I had taken on my palm somewhere in the last days of riding. I had not mentioned it. She had found it while handing me something and simply taken my hand and looked without asking permission, which somehow had not bothered me at all, when she pressed her thumb gently against the pulse inside my wrist. And the world changed. It came in through my chest before it arrived anywhere else, the way heat comes before a fire is visible. A recognition so deep it bypassed reason entirely. I had heard pack elders speak of the bond. I had read accounts of it, dry and clinical, in the records of caravan hold. I had waited for it, distantly, without urgency, the way you wait for weather you know is coming but cannot see yet. Nothing had prepared me for this. It was not pain. It was not a sound or a light or any of the things the old accounts described. It was simply recognition. The specific sensation of a name that has been on the tip of your tongue for years, suddenly spoken aloud. Yes, that is it. That is the thing. How did I not know this until now? Every place in me that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting, went still, and then went full, and I sat there at her table with my breath stopped in my chest, and her thumb on my pulse, and tried to keep my face from showing her what was happening. I looked at our hands. The mark was coming. Not the full blaze yet, it builds in degrees, the old accounts had said that much, and I could feel it building, a warmth tracing the old faint lines on my inner wrist that I had noticed years ago and assumed were simply part of how I was made. They were not simply how I was made. They had been waiting, the same way everything in me had been waiting, and now they were waking. She had not looked at her own wrist yet. She was still holding my hand, her attention on the small cut she had been dressing, and I made myself breathe. Made myself be still, made myself think through what was coming and what I owed her by way of truth before it arrived. Your pulse is steadier, she said. Yes. She looked up, and whatever she saw in my face, I do not know what I was wearing there, I had not sorted it yet. She went quiet. Her hand did not move from mine. She simply looked at me for a moment, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. Then she looked down. The mark on her wrist was faint but visible, a tracing of silver light, tentative as the first light before dawn, moving along lines that had clearly been there before but had never been illuminated. I watched her look at it. I watched her process it in the same careful, steady way she processed everything, not with panic, but with the focused attention of a person who has decided that what is real and must be worked with. She raised her eyes to mine. This is a mate mark, she said. Yes! A pause. Outside, the snow had slowed. The light through her window was the clear, pale light of a storm breaking. You're not a steward, she said. No. You know what you are. Yes. She did not pull her hand away. I had half expected her to, the shock of it, the sudden understanding of what the mark meant, of what I was. Instead, she sat there with my hand in hers and looked at me with that same steady appraisal, the expression that had been the first thing I had seen on her face when she opened the door to me 3 nights ago. Tell me, she said. So I told her. All of it. My name, my title, the border survey, the storm, the fever, the 5 days of riding alone through my eastern territories. I told her about the waypost 8 miles back, and the horse I had left there, and about the pass closing, and the light in her window. I told her about my counsel, who would be frantic by now, and about the pack house at Caravan Hold that was never as quiet or as warm as her kitchen. She listened without interrupting. She was very good at listening. She gave every word its fair weight, the same as she gave everything. She was the most fair-handed person I had ever encountered, now that I was naming things about her. When I stopped talking, she was quiet for a long moment. You were going to leave without telling me, she said. I thought about denying it. I did not. I was going to return, formally. I was trying to decide how. Why? Because I did not want you to be. I searched for the word, managed. I did not want you to be managed because of what I am. I wanted. I stopped. She waited. I wanted what we had in here, I said, and even to my own ears it came out plainly, without the careful frame I usually put around true things. 3 days of someone looking at me the way you look at things. Like I was just, what was there? Something in her face shifted, softened. Not sentimentally, she was not sentimental. I had understood that by now, but it moved. You should have told me sooner, she said. I know. I would have. She paused, reconsidered. I don't know what I would have done, she said honestly. I might have behaved differently, and I don't know if that would have been better. But you should have told me. Yes. She looked at our hands again. The silver tracing on her wrist was settling into something steadier, a warmth that I could feel as faint pressure against my own marked skin. The bond full completing would take a ceremony, a formal exchange of marks, a witnessed moment, but its existence was not in question. It had declared itself with the same matter-of-fact certainty she brought to everything, as though it too had looked at the situation and decided the most efficient course was simply to be honest. I don't know anything about pack ceremonies, she said, or how this works. I'm a village healer from Greythorn, with a pantry that needs restocking, and a wood stack that was behind before you arrived. I know. I'm not. She looked for the word. I'm not what anyone would expect. No one is, I said. That's what I've come to understand about fated mates. The bond doesn't consult expectations. The corner of her mouth moved again. The shadow of a smile, fuller this time. That's either very comforting or completely alarming, she said. I've been going back and forth on it for 3 days. She laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of her, but real. The realest sound I had heard in years, and I felt it land somewhere specific in my chest and stay there. She looked at me for a long moment. At the mark. At my face. I need you to understand, she said carefully, that I am not saying yes because you are a king. I know. And I'm not saying yes because of the mark, exactly. She considered. I'm saying yes because of the last 3 days. Because you drank what I gave you without arguing about it, and split the wood without being asked to. And because when I asked you questions you answered them plainly, even when the answers were careful. She paused. Even when the answer was careful, I could tell the difference between a man being careful and a man being dishonest. You were careful. You weren't dishonest. I looked at our joined hands, at the silver tracing warming on both wrists, at the pale, clear light coming through her window onto the small table, and the 2 cups and the remnants of the morning's bread. Is that a yes? I asked. She looked at me with that particular expression, the one that was not quite a smile, but held everything a smile usually holds. And she said, that's a yes. We stayed another hour in her kitchen while she finished what she was working on, and I sat and watched the snow thinning outside, and felt the strange, uncluttered calm of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for. It was nothing like I had imagined the bond would feel. I had imagined something louder, more dramatic, the accounts of ceremony marks blazing and courts going silent, and the gathered pack bearing witness to the destined union. This was 2 people at a kitchen table, one of them a healer sorting the last of her seed pods, the other a king, trying to figure out whether the rest of his life would be better if it contained more mornings that felt like this one. The answer was obvious. The answer had been obvious since she opened the door. She packed a traveling bag with the brisk efficiency of a woman who does not believe in sentimentality about objects. A few changes of clothing, her healer's kit, a particular knife she used for plant work. 3 books that she said she was not leaving behind for anything. She locked the cottage with a key she wore on a cord around her neck, and she looked at it for a moment before tucking it under her collar. I'll come back, she said. To herself or to the cottage, I wasn't sure. To both, perhaps. To close it properly. We'll come back, I said. She looked at me. Something settled in her face. We'll come back, she agreed. The waypost was 8 miles, and we walked 4 of them before we found a patrol I could flag down. My council had apparently sent out 3 search parties when I failed to return on schedule, which was not a surprise and which I would have to address diplomatically when we arrived, since they meant well and I had not told them where I was going, which I recognize was not entirely fair. The patrol riders were young, and they pulled up when they saw me, and I watched their faces go through the sequence I had come to expect: recognition, relief, a sharp and complicated alarm at what my current state implied about the last 3 days, and then, when they took in Mira standing beside me, her traveling bag, the silver tracing visible at her wrist beside mine, something else. Awe, I think, and a kind of recognition that was older than reason, the thing a wolf knows when it sees what the bond has done. The youngest of them, a rider named Tolan, who had been patrolling my eastern borders for 2 years, took one look at the matching marks and got off his horse and went down on one knee in the snow without a word. Mira watched this with wide eyes. That's going to keep happening, I told her quietly. Why? Because they can see the mark, I said, and they know what it means. They've been looking for their Luna for a long time. She looked at Tolan, still kneeling in the snow with his head bowed, and then she looked at me. Tell him to stand up, she said. He'll freeze his knees. Tolan, I said, on your feet. He stood, and I could see him trying to compose his face, and failing, because he was 23, and he had just seen something he would tell his children about. My Lady Luna, he said to Mira, careful, formal, trying to do it properly. She nodded at him the way she nodded at everything, acknowledging a fact that had been brought to her attention, weighing it, deciding it was acceptable. Thank you, she said. Is there a horse for him as well? He's been on foot since last night. Tolan looked at me. I shrugged in a way I hoped communicated that this was the nature of things now and it was best simply to proceed. The ride back to Caravan Hold took until late afternoon. Mira spent most of it quiet, watching the landscape change as we moved north. The border scrubland giving way to the Caravan Forest, the snow-covered dark of the pines, the wide white river valley where the hold sat on its ridge above the confluence, the towers visible from 3 miles out. I watched her watching it. I watched her take it in the same way she had taken in everything, carefully, without performance, storing it for later. It's larger than I expected, she said. Is that good or bad? She considered. Neither, she decided. It's just larger. I'll learn the shape of it. I thought of the hold's corridors, the hall with its firelight, the long echoing spaces that had been too large for too long, the seat of a king who kept everyone at the appropriate distance, and had been doing it so successfully he had begun to forget what warmth felt like, until a fever and a snowstorm delivered him to a healer's cottage, where warmth was simply how the air was kept. There's a room off the east wing, I said, quiet, good light. I was thinking it might do well as a workroom, for plants, for whatever you need. She turned from the landscape to look at me. You thought of that in the last hour, she said. I thought of it on the second morning, I said, when you showed me how you dry the bark strips. Something in her expression shifted, not swept away, not dazzled, but moved. Moved the way she moved when something was true. All right, she said, show me the room when we get there. The council was waiting in the great hall. They were trying not to show how relieved they were and mostly failing. My advisor Reich, who has served me 15 years and who has the instincts of a man who has survived longer than he expected by reading rooms quickly, took one look at Mira standing beside me and at the twin silver marks at our wrists and said nothing at all for nearly a full breath. Then he bowed, a real bow, the kind that comes from the chest. My Lady Luna, he said, and his voice was entirely steady, which told me he had expected something like this and had prepared himself for the possibility. He was that sort of man. The others followed. The hall went through its moment of understanding, the ripple of recognition moving through the gathered pack members who had been waiting for news of their king, and I watched it arrive in their faces one by one. The sight of the marks, the understanding of what stood beside me, the thing their wolves knew even before their minds caught up. Mira stood through it without flinching. She was not unmoved. I could see that, but she was steady. She had the steadiness of someone who has learned not to let uncertainty show until she has had time to think about it. And she was thinking. I could see her thinking, storing and ordering the new information. When the hall had settled, I told Reich to set up the east room. My description of it was general and he would figure out the specifics, he always did. And I told the council we would speak in the morning, and I took Mira through the hold the way she had asked. Room by room, the corridors and the great hall and the kitchen below. The east wing with its long windows looking out over the river valley, where the snow lay clean and deep in the last light of the day. The east room was what I had said. Good light, quiet, a long low shelf along the north wall that had held maps and now held nothing. She stood in the middle of it and turned a full slow circle, taking in the windows, the shelf, the stone floor, the low-hanging candle arm that would need replenishing. This will do, she said. I thought so. She turned to face me. The silver marks on our wrists had deepened in the hours since we had left the cottage. Not yet the full blaze of a completed bond, but vivid and steady. The warmth of them a constant thing I had already begun to stop noticing. The way you stop noticing the sound of a fire once you have been near it long enough. Rane, she said. It was the first time she had said my name. She had been careful with it since the kitchen, using it sparingly, as though she was learning the weight of it before deciding how to carry it. Yes. I have a question. Ask it. The last 3 days, she said. Was any of it? She searched for the word. Performed? For my benefit? I thought about the fever, the bench by the hearth, the bucket from the well, the evenings with the fire. I thought about what had been easiest in that cottage and why it had been easy. No, I said, none of it. She looked at me for a moment with that assessing look, the one that decided whether an answer was careful or honest. All right, she said. She turned back to the window. The last light was going, the sky behind the forest turning the pale gray of deep winter dusk, the first stars showing above the ridge. I'll need my own supply of wax for the candle arm, she said. The ones they put in these holds never burn evenly. I'll have it brought from the market. And a second shelf. The north wall one will be full within a month. Done. And I want to keep seeing the village. Graythorn. Not every week, but often enough. The woman with the joint ache will be worse in the cold, and there's a boy with a recurring chest complaint that I haven't quite sorted. We'll arrange it. She nodded, satisfied, the way she nodded when the information she had brought to a situation had been received and acted upon, and the situation could proceed. She looked at the window one more time, at the snow and the dark, and the stars beginning to appear. I would have let you stay anyway, she said quietly. That first night, even if I hadn't opened the door to find you there. Even if you were just a traveling man who was sick and needed shelter. She was quiet for a moment. I want you to know that. I looked at her in the dusk of the east room, at the silver mark steady on her wrist, at the woman who had let me into her cottage and her kitchen and her quiet, and given me 3 days of being simply what I was. I know, I said. Good, she said, and turned from the window to face me, and I took her hand, because it was the most honest thing I could think of to do. And the bond hummed between us, and outside the snow lay still and deep over Caravan Hold. And somewhere in the pack house below, a door opened, and a voice called something about supper, and my Luna said, I hope it's better than you described, and I found that I could not remember the last time I had looked forward to eating. It is a small thing to remember. I have remembered it every day since.